Imagine training for months through hunger, exhaustion, and silence just to give it all up seconds before the finish line. Why? Because someone needed help, more than you needed victory. This is the story of Jalen Carter, a poor teen from the South Side with nothing but an old pair of shoes and an impossible dream. In the biggest race of his life, Jalen was about to do the unthinkable. Beat the odds, beat the favorites, and cross the line first. But when the girl ahead of him collapsed, everything stopped. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was the daughter of a billionaire. All he knew was that she couldn't breathe. What Jalen did next shocked no one watching, because no one was watching. But 2 days later, when a black Cadillac pulled up outside his trailer, the world changed. This isn't a story about running. It's about what kind of person you become when no one's looking. If this story hits your heart, drop a like, comment your favorite moment, and subscribe for more real stories with real soul. The finish line was just ahead. Jalen Carter, a 14-year-old kid with threadbare shoes and lungs burning from the cold air, was on the verge of something unthinkable. First place. It wasn't just a medal to him. It was a ticket, a chance, a miracle. He had trained in silence with no crowd cheering him on, no gear sponsorship, no fancy trainers on his heels. Just pain, just purpose. Every step was a rebellion against the weight that tried to hold him down, poverty, responsibility, and all the quiet voices that said kids like him don't get to win. But then, as he surged past mile 24, it happened. The girl in front of him, long blonde ponytail, swaying stride beginning to falter, collapsed hard. Her body crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut face first into the gravel. For a half second, Jalen almost couldn't process it. She had been flying. Now she wasn't moving. The path ahead was clear. Victory was literally steps away, and yet his feet didn't move forward. They pivoted. Jalen dropped beside her, checked her pulse like they taught in health class. Weak, rapid. He glanced up. No medic in sight, except one far back. Radio pressed to her ear, overwhelmed. "We've got a runner down," she shouted, panic in her voice. "No backup at checkpoint 5, need assistance now." The medic locked eyes with him. "I can't move her. Can you carry her?" Without a word, Jalen lifted the girl, awkward, dead weight in his arms, and started running the other direction. Every muscle screamed. His legs, already shattered from the race, buckled. Sweat poured, his vision blurred. But he didn't stop. When they reached the medic bench, he laid her down gently, helped prop her legs, watched as cold packs were applied and water pressed to her lips. The medic whispered, "You saved her. You really saved her." "See?" Jalen didn't reply. He just stood there, chest-heaving eyes locked on her pale face. Then he turned around and started running again, not for glory now, but because he wasn't finished. He crossed the line in 5th place. No one clapped. No one asked what happened. The crowd cheered for someone else, but somewhere behind him, a girl was breathing again. And somewhere inside him, something bigger than victory had taken root. He hadn't just run a race, he had made a choice. And that choice would echo far louder than any applause. Before the marathon, before the cameras, before anyone knew his name, Jalen Carter was just another quiet kid from the South Side trailer park, running through cracked sidewalks and back alleys. Like it was the only thing that made sense, he lived in a 2-bedroom trailer with his mother, younger sister, and older brother. His father had vanished years ago. No note, no explanation, just absence. His mother worked double shifts at the diner, coming home with sore feet and eyes that had forgotten how to dream. His brother worked construction when there was work, drank when there wasn't. And his little sister Mia, she was the light. The one person Jalen would do anything for, Mia, had asthma. The kind that didn't care whether the medicine was affordable. That month, Jalen knew the sound of her wheezing better than he knew his own heartbeat. Sometimes, when the inhaler ran dry and the ER bill wasn't paid off, he'd just sit beside her bed and hold her hand, counting the seconds between her breaths. That was the weight he carried when he ran. He didn't run to train. He ran to make it to school on time, after delivering newspapers at dawn. He ran between grocery store shifts and tutoring sessions. He ran because buses didn't reach the trailer park and no one was coming to save them. But when he ran, something changed. The world shrank to just his heartbeat and the rhythm of his feet. No bills, no hunger. No watching his mom cry in the kitchen when she thought everyone was asleep. Running made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he was more than the limits placed around him. No one really noticed except for Coach Riley. Riley wasn't flashy, a retired runner himself. He had a limp in one leg and a voice that didn't rise above calm. But he saw things. One afternoon during gym, while the other kids jogged lazily, Jalen took off like something wild. Coach didn't say anything that day, but he started showing up after school. He didn't ask Jalen to stay. He just waited, leaning on the fence, holding a stopwatch and a bottle of water. And after a few weeks, he brought an old pair of running shoes, broken in but solid. "They're not pretty," Coach said, "but they've still got some miles left." Jalen hesitated. "My mom thinks running's a waste of time." Coach nodded. "Then don't run for time. Run for truth." It didn't happen overnight. Jalen still delivered papers, still stocked shelves, still did homework while rocking Mia to sleep. But now, after all that, he ran in silence under moonlight, on empty school tracks with busted fences and no lights. His shoes slapped pavement, his breath visible in winter air. No fans, no teammates, just one boy refusing to be forgotten. At school, few understood. Some mocked his shoes patched together with duct tape. Others laughed when they heard he was entering the state marathon. "This ain't a charity race." Troy Bennett had sneered, "You gonna trip over your busted laces." Troy the mayor's son, the golden boy, tall, smirking. Already sponsored before he even hit 17, Jalen said nothing. He never did. What would have been the point? No one cared about the kid from the trailer park. No one thought he'd even finish the race. But they didn't know where he came from. They didn't know that running wasn't his escape. It was his statement. "I'm still here, I'm still moving, and I'm not stopping." Coach Riley didn't believe in speeches. He believed in showing up. After that first run in gym class, he started appearing more often at the edge of the parking lot after school, leaning on the same rusty fence by the busted track. He never asked Jalen to train. He just stood there, stopwatch in hand, waiting. It wasn't a recruitment pitch. It was an invitation to be seen. Jalen didn't take it at first. He was busy. Always was. Deliveries in the morning, homework in the evening, double shifts on weekends. Time wasn't just limited. It was survival. But the coach kept coming back, rain or shine, always with that patient look like he knew something. Jalen didn't. One Friday just before sunset, Jalen cracked. He jogged over to the track after stocking shelves for 4 hours, still in his store apron, hands smelling of cardboard and dust. Coach handed him a water bottle, without a word, stepped back and clicked the stopwatch. That was it. No tips, no corrections, no expectations. Just a silent belief that the boy in front of him deserved to try. From then on, they became a rhythm. Jalen ran laps. Coach timed and nodded. They barely spoke, but they didn't have to. Every second shaved off was a conversation. Every drop of sweat was a sentence. Every blister was a declaration. A few weeks in, Coach Riley handed Jalen a box. Inside were shoes not new, but clean. Old-school Nike's faded logo, sole still strong. "Used to wear these in college," he said. "They've still got a story or two in them." Jalen held them like they were glass. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." "My mom won't be thrilled." Coach looked at him steady. "Then don't tell her yet. Let your feet do the talking." He smiled just faintly. That was the first time Jalen saw emotion crack through that stoic face. The weeks that followed became a blur of work school and secret night training. Jalen never complained. He'd come home late, shower quickly, kiss Mia on the forehead, and lie to his mom about falling asleep in the library. She didn't question much. She was too tired. The only one who ever noticed was his older brother, Theo. "You really think this'll change anything?" Theo asked one night. "You think running's gonna fix rent, Mom's back, Mia's lungs?" Jalen didn't answer. He just laced up his shoes tighter and walked out the door, because it didn't have to fix everything. It just had to be something. Meanwhile, at school, whispers started. "Why's he always sweaty in the morning? Where'd he get those shoes? Dude thinks he's in a movie or something." Troy Bennett, of course, turned it into a show. He strutted into the hallway one morning, holding up a photo of his marathon entry form, "State Champion Baby." He shouted, "Hope the kid from Southside packed his inhaler." The air's thinner up front. Jalen ignored him as always, but the sting lingered, not because he believed Troy, but because some part of him feared everyone else did. One afternoon, Coach Riley stopped him mid-lap. "You're thinking too much." Jalen, panting, wiped his brow. "It's just a lot." Coach studied him. "You ever see a bird fly with weights tied to its wings?" "No." "Then cut the noise." Simple, direct, true. And when registration for the state marathon opened, Coach Riley didn't ask for permission. He just paid the fee out of pocket and filled in Jalen's name. "You don't need to win," he said, handing him the confirmation sheet. "You just need to run with people who believe they can." Jalen stared at the paper. His name was there among names from prep academies, athletic clubs, rich suburbs. He looked up. "Okay," he said quietly, "let's go." Because now someone else believed, and that meant everything. Word got around. At first, it was just a whisper. "That kid from Southside is running the state marathon." A few students raised eyebrows, some teachers exchanged glances, but most just shrugged it off until the list came out. There it was, printed in bold Nook 212, Jalen Carter, Southside Middle School. Troy Bennett nearly choked on his protein shake when he saw it in the locker room. "You've got to be kidding me?" He laughed, holding up the roster. Jalen, the janitor's son. "What's he running for charity?" Laughter followed, loud cutting. Jalen heard it. Of course he did, but he kept walking, same hallway, same steps, same silence. Coach Riley told him not to look back. "Run your race." He'd say, "Not theirs." Still, the days leading up to the marathon were a storm. Jalen trained harder than ever, even on days when his feet bled through the socks, even when Mia had a coughing fit that kept them up all night. He found ways to adapt. He ran at dawn, pushing through fog. He sprinted behind garbage trucks just to get used to stale air. He wore a second-hand weighted vest donated by Coach's old buddy from the VA. "You look like a superhero," Mia giggled one morning as he strapped it on. He winked at her. "Nah, just a brother who runs fast." At school, things shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. A few classmates stopped snickering. One teacher left an energy bar on his desk with no note. The librarian started saving him sports magazines. Even the janitor, Mr. Hayes, nodded once. "Used to run track in '78. He said, 'Still got my spikes, you got fire, kid?' It wasn't support. Not really, but it wasn't mockery either. And that meant something." Troy kept talking. Of course, that was his thing. "Better stretch real good," he shouted across the cafeteria one afternoon. "Wouldn't want you pulling a dream." But deep down, even Troy started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a joke. One day after a particularly brutal practice, Jalen sat with Coach Riley under the bleachers. His legs trembled, his throat burned. He hadn't spoken for minutes. Then Coach said, "You know what this is about, right?" "Winning?" Jalen asked. Coach shook his head slowly. "No, it's about carrying every no you've ever been handed and running straight through it." Jalen looked down at his shoes, Coach's old ones, faded, frayed, sacred. He nodded. The night before the race, Jalen couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor near Mia's bed, listening to her soft breaths. His mother was asleep on the couch, an unpaid power bill, folded neatly on the coffee table. Outside, sirens echoed somewhere in the city. He whispered to himself, "You don't have to win, just don't stop." When he showed up at the starting line the next morning, surrounded by bright gear, compression sleeves, Bluetooth headsets, and high-tech shoes. Jalen stood quiet in a thrift store hoodie, his bib hung slightly crooked. 212, Coach Riley leaned in. "You ready?" Jalen exhaled. "I've been ready." Because this wasn't about medals, this was about proving that a boy with nothing could still carry everything and keep running anyway. The air was razor-sharp that morning. Cold wind swept through the city streets as hundreds of runners lined up, colorful jerseys, neon shoes, sleek headphones. Everyone was bouncing, stretching, psyching themselves up. Jalen stood among them, nearly invisible. No earbuds, no gear, just a hoodie. The old shoes and bib number, 212, slightly crooked on his chest. Coach Riley placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, this isn't about the finish line, it's about the fire." Jalen nodded. "Let's light it then." The starting horn blared, and they were off. At first, Jalen held back just like they'd practiced. Let the overconfident kids burn out. Let the cameras follow the flash. He stayed steady, breathing controlled, stride clean. At mile 5, he passed the first pack of runners. At mile 10, the pain crept in, but he pushed harder. By mile 16, he caught sight of Troy. The golden boy was already struggling, cheeks flushed, breathing ragged. Jalen passed him without a word. No smirk, no satisfaction, just focus. The crowd started to notice, a few murmurs, a few cheers. "That's the South Side kid." By mile 22, he was in third, and then second. Only one runner ahead of him, Avery Whitman. She was sharp, lean-trained, sponsored, the daughter of wealth and legacy. But even now, Jalen noticed something was off. Her form wavered. Her cadence, once perfect, faltered. At mile 24, it happened. Her left foot clipped the edge of the trail. She staggered, reached out, missed, and fell, hard onto the dirt path, her body twitching as she gasped for breath. Jalen's instincts kicked in. He slowed, then stopped. His brain screamed, "Keep running. The finish line is right there." But his heart turned around. A lone medic knelt beside her, radio in hand, eyes frantic. "We've got a runner down at checkpoint 5. Possible heat stroke, no backup, need assistance now." Jalen didn't hesitate. He knelt beside Avery, checked her pulse, shallow, fast. Her skin was dry and burning. "She needs fluids and shade." The medic said, voice cracking, "Can you help me move her?" Jalen nodded. He slipped his arms beneath her, lifted her with everything he had. The strain was instant. His legs screamed, every tendon threatened to snap, but he moved. One step at a time back, toward the medic bench. Each step felt like a mile. His vision blurred. His breath came in sharp bursts. Mud pulled at his feet. He nearly fell twice, but he didn't stop. Avery moaned faintly in his arms. "Where am I?" "You're okay," he panted. "Almost there." When he finally reached the bench, the medic took over. Cold packs. Water feet elevated. Vitals monitored. "She's stabilizing," the medic whispered. "You saved her." Jalen nodded once, wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned. He ran again, this time slower. Not for glory, not for placement. Just because he needed to finish. As he neared the final stretch, other runners began to pass him. Some looked confused, some didn't even notice. But Jalen didn't care. He crossed the finish line in 5th place. No camera turned toward him. No announcer shouted his name. The medals went to others. But Coach Riley was there waiting at the end, eyes locked on Jalen with a kind of quiet fire. "You didn't have to stop," he said softly. "I couldn't leave her." Jalen replied. Coach smiled, small and proud. "No, you couldn't." There were no cheers, just two people who knew the truth. Later that night at home, Jalen sat on the edge of his bed. His shoes were caked in mud. His race bib was crumpled beside him. He glanced across the room at Mia's photo taped to the wall above her inhaler. He hadn't won. But something about that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the moment he stopped chasing validation and started becoming who he was meant to be. The finish line had never been so quiet. Jalen stood there, legs trembling, lungs raw watching, as the top 3 winners posed with their medals, cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, cheers echoed across the track like thunder. But none of it was for him. He looked down at his bib, mud-smeared, wrinkled. His hoodie clung to his back, soaked with sweat. His old shoes were covered in dirt and dried leaves. His hands still smelled faintly of the electrolyte gel he'd held under Avery's tongue. He hadn't even taken the water cup offered at the end. No one handed him one. They were too busy celebrating the ones who had finished first. Coach Riley stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes locked on Jalen. He didn't speak, not right away. He just watched. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. Eventually, Jalen walked over. Coach placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let them think what they want." He said, "You and me, we know what happened out there." Jalen nodded once. It should have felt like enough, but it didn't. Back at school on Monday, the hallway was colder than usual. A few kids nodded awkwardly. One kid from math class whispered, "You almost had it," without making eye contact. Another muttered, "All that training for 5th place?" Troy walked by silent this time, offering nothing but a smug glance that said, "I didn't need to stop for anyone." In the lunchroom, Jalen sat alone. He thought for a second about telling someone what really happened. About Avery, the collapse, the medic alone, the run back through the mud with her in his arms. But the moment passed. If they needed a medal to believe the truth, maybe they weren't ready to hear it. Coach Riley caught him after practice that afternoon. "You want me to talk to the principal?" He asked. "Put out a statement. Get ahead of it." Jalen shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Let it sit. Truth's still truth, even if no one claps for it." That night, Jalen sat outside the trailer on the steps, hoodie zipped to his chin. The sun had set. The streetlight flickered above, casting long shadows down the empty lot. He looked up at the stars, not bright, but stubborn, and for the first time in a long while he felt seen, not by a crowd, not by a headline, but by something bigger, by the part of himself that knew he had done what was right, even when no one else had noticed. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than gold. 2 days later, the knock came. Not a tap. Not a fist pounding in frustration. Just 3 calm, deliberate knocks on the thin metal door of the Carter family's trailer. Jalen was folding laundry. Mia was coloring quietly on the floor. Their mother, still in her work apron, looked up with tired eyes. When she opened the door, a black Cadillac sat, parked out front, engine still humming. Its shine looked out of place on their gravel driveway, like a spaceship had landed in the middle of a forgotten world. Out stepped a tall man in a tailored charcoal gray suit. His shoes didn't touch mud. They glided. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. His posture made even silence feel formal. Beside him, slightly pale, and in a soft sling, stood Avery Whitman. Jalen froze. "Are you Jalen Carter?" the man asked, voice low but commanding. Jalen stepped forward, his heart now pounding louder than it had during the race. "Yes, sir." "I'm Avery's father," the man said. "She told me everything." Avery gave a small smile. "You saved my life." She said gently, I don't think I would have made it if you hadn't stopped." Jalen looked at her, unsure how to respond. He didn't want thanks. He hadn't done it for this. But Mr. Whitman wasn't finished. "I don't hand out charity," he said, "and I don't believe in pity. But I do believe in honoring character. What you did on that trail, that was bigger than sportsmanship. That was leadership." He reached into his coat and handed over a folder-thick, official-looking, "I sponsor a private youth training program. Full scholarships, elite coaching. Real opportunity, I'd like you to join." Jalen blinked. "A scholarship." "Not just that," Mr. Whitman added, turning to face Jalen's mother. "For you, ma'am, and your family, I have openings at 2 of my regional companies, management level, full benefits." Silence swept the doorway. Not the awkward kind. The kind that fills a room just before tears fall. Jalen's mom covered her mouth, eyes glassy. His brother stepped from the back room stunned. Even Mia looked up, her crayon frozen in midair. And behind them all, standing at the edge of the driveway with hands in his jacket pockets, was Coach Riley. Jalen turned toward him. "If I go," he said clearly, "he goes too. He's the reason I got this far." Mr. Whitman raised an eyebrow, looked over at the older man, then nodded slowly. "Every good team needs a coach with heart. Consider him invited." Coach Riley blinked once like he hadn't expected that. Then he smiled just faintly. No more words were needed. The Cadillac pulled away. After a few more goodbyes, Avery gave Jalen a quick look over her shoulder, grateful, respectful, not pity, not admiration. Recognition. Jalen stood on the porch long after they were gone. He didn't feel like a hero, he didn't feel like a winner, but for the first time, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. Not for his speed, but for his choice. Things changed after that day, but not all at once. The Carter family didn't wake up in a mansion. They still had bills, still had struggles, but for the first time in years, there was breathing room, steady jobs, a working fridge. Mia got her inhaler on time. Theo started night school. Their mother slept 8 hours for the first time in a decade. Jalen, he trained every morning. He showed up at the new facility, indoor track professional trainers, state-of-the-art gear that still felt foreign on his back. He listened, he pushed, he grew, but he never forgot the shoes. He kept them. The old pair Coach Riley had given him, the ones with faded soles and sweat-stained laces. He wrapped them in a towel and placed them in a shoebox under his bed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that greatness isn't built in arenas. It's revealed in moments no one else sees. Coach Riley came with him, of course. Now listed as Senior Development Advisor on the team's website, he still wore his same windbreaker, still carried the same stopwatch, still said very little. But every time Jalen laced up, the coach was there. A nod, a count. A shared glance that said, "We remember where this started." Avery visited sometimes. She didn't bring cameras or expectations. She'd watch quietly from the bleachers. One day she approached. I saw the footage. She said, "From the checkpoint, the medic's body cam caught it." Jalen nodded. "You could have won." She said, "I did," he replied. She studied him for a second, then nodded. "You did." They didn't become best friends, but there was respect, mutual, unspoken, and enough. Months passed. Seasons shifted. Jalen's name began appearing in race results. Not just city, not just state, national, but no matter how far he ran, he returned. Once a month, he went back to Southside Middle School, volunteered with the gym class, talked to kids who'd stopped believing they were worth noticing. He'd say the same thing every time: "You don't have to be the fastest, just don't stop moving." One fall afternoon he noticed a boy, maybe 10 years old, sitting alone near the track. Small frame, nervous hands, no shoes. Jalen walked over. "You want to run?" The boy shrugged. "I don't got anything to run in," Jalen smiled. He unzipped his bag, pulled out a soft old shoebox. Inside, wrapped in a towel, were the shoes, Coach's shoes, the ones that had carried Jalen to the moment. Everything changed. He knelt, held them out. "They're not new." Jalen said, "But they'll take you somewhere?" The boy's eyes widened. He took the shoes like they were made of gold. As the boy ran his first lap, awkward, clumsy, determined Coach Riley leaned against the fence nearby, watching. He glanced at Jalen, eyes smiling, full circle. He said. Jalen shook his head slowly. "Nah," he said softly, watching the boy disappear down the track. "It's just the next lap." And just like that, the story kept running. In a world obsessed with winning, we often forget the value of choosing what's right over what's rewarding. Jalen Carter didn't come from privilege. He didn't run with fans cheering or sponsors chasing. He ran for his family, for his future, for something bigger than himself. And when the ultimate test came, not a final sprint, but a moral crossroad, he chose to stop, to help, to care, to carry someone who couldn't keep going. No spotlight, no guarantee of recognition, just heart. That one moment changed everything, not because of who he saved, but because of who he chose to be. And isn't that what true character is? Not doing good when the world is watching, but when it's not. Today, Jalen's story reminds us that our choices define us far more than our trophies, that sometimes the quietest victories echo the loudest, and that one act of kindness done in the dark can light the way for someone else. So, next time you're racing toward your goal, ask yourself, will you run past the fallen, or will you be the one who stops? If this story moved, you share it. Comment your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.